The other centerpiece of the Sustainable Development Goals, to which everyone pays homage, is, of course, gender equality. And there is a fascination and a focus on women and girls now which hasn't been in place these last many years. I mean, it just must be admitted and recognized that the world is in a froth of anxiety about what it has done to women and girls, and how do you correct the discrimination that is palpable and endemic when it comes to gender. And that is a subject of intense discussion everywhere within the international community. I have believed much of my adult life, I suppose I should be more honest about it, I have believed most of my married life, because I married a sublime feminist who managed to alter my socialist views to understand that they were of little value if they were not feminist socialist views. And so I have finally come to the recognition, took a while, but I felt it deeply over these last many years, that the single most important struggle on the planet, bar none, is the struggle for gender equality. There's nothing close to it. You cannot achieve. You cannot achieve any semblance of social justice by marginalizing more than 50% of the world's population. It's just not on. So this struggle to deal with gender equality is extraordinary and overarching, and has now involved great numbers of people. And it deals with everything from international sexual trafficking to female genital mutilation to property rights to inheritance rights to political representation to economic wherewithal, and tends to focus, interestingly enough, when looking at the Sustainable Development Goals and what is going on in the international community, it tends to focus on sexual violence. That has become the benchmark, the measure. And it's not merely sexual violence in conflict. It's not merely the depravity and horror of ISIS or Boko Haram or Syria. It's not merely the most egregious and horrifying exemplars of sexual violence, but it's also in conflict, that is. It's also intimate partner violence and marital rape and gang rape and every manifestation of sexual abuse that haunts so many societies and from which no country is free, no country on the planet is free. And I must say, if I can speak very personally about it, that to visit some of these countries, to spend time, for example, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, in the eastern region called the Kivus, in the little regional southern capital of Bukavu, where there is a hospital called the Panzi Hospital, headed by a remarkable and wonderful surgeon named Dr. Denis Mukwege, who just won the Sakharov Prize, the Human Rights Prize in Europe, and will, I have no doubt, be a Nobel Peace Prize recipient at one point in the next few years. When you watch what has happened to the hundreds of thousands of women who have been raped and mutilated and violated and savaged in the course of 15 and 20 years of merciless internal conflict, and how Dr. Mukwege spends much of his life, and the other surgeons in the hospital spend much of their lives surgically repairing the reproductive tracts of the women, and the women then desperately attempt to convalesce in what is called a city of joy adjoining the Panzi Hospital, a city of joy created by Eve Ensler, the woman who wrote the Vagina Monologues. And you see this extraordinary resilience and effort at survival on the part of these astonishingly courageous and wonderful women, but how their lives have been so destroyed, how justice has been removed from them, how the sense of isolation and despair can overtake them, even though they are of immensely strong and remarkable spirit. And one realizes that sexual violence is no longer a tool of war. Sexual violence has become, in so many countries and communities, a strategy of war because it costs nothing and it intimidates and terrifies entire villages and towns and cities and countries and drives people into the hinterland and destroys the fabric of the nation and eviscerates the soul of so many of the women and their families. And the need to confront sexual violence and to deal with the horror of it all must become one of the distinct measures of gender equality. And it is beyond belief that the world can continue to tolerate so much vindictive and savage abuse of women reported time and time again and received in the reports as though it was the simple passage of nondescript activity to which the world is given. I don't get it. I just don't get it. I mean, I'm not given to some sweet innocence. I've been around, but I don't understand the willingness to watch this happen endlessly. And I want to tell you something about that which is vexing my soul. You won't have to invite me back, Nancy. Once I have disgorged this, you won't want me back. As Andy was kind enough to say in his introduction, I co-direct an NGO called AIDS Free World. The name is a little misleading because what we try to do is deal with the most controversial subjects that are the social determinants of HIV and AIDS. We try to look at those factors which cause the virus and cause it to spread and cause the pandemic. And in the process, of course, when you have sexual violence, you tend to, in many countries, infect the women whom you are assaulting. So there is a very strong connection between sexual violence and HIV. And we became more and more interested in these patterns of sexual violence and what they were doing to societies. And then it was really my colleague, a woman from Boston named Paula Donovan, my co-director, who happened on the reality that this was almost beyond belief, that there were a number of peacekeeping operations in the world, United Nations peacekeepers who were sexually assaulting the civilian population. And this seemed almost beyond imagination. Peacekeepers coming to provide protection for the civil population, the civilian population, ending up sexually abusing the civilian population. So we couldn't believe it, and we tried to understand the origins of this. How was this happening? Why was the United Nations, the basic multilateral institution in the world, why was it allowing this to happen? I mean, whether you know it or not, peacekeeping is the biggest undertaking the United Nations has. It costs $8.27 billion a year. There are 16 peacekeeping missions with well over 100,000 military and 20 to 30,000 administrative staff, civil service staff. I mean, it's a huge operation. How was it that the United Nations would allow this to happen? And we suddenly realized, Paula realized, that it went back to something called the Convention on Privileges and Immunities, which was passed in 1946. And was meant to provide some immunity for diplomats in the course of doing their jobs so they wouldn't be harassed by governments who didn't like what the UN was undertaking. And instead, the immunity has served as a mask to protect peacekeepers from charge and conviction if they are engaged in sexual assaults. So we said to ourselves, all right, we're going to investigate this thing. We're going to really do some research and go after the UN and see if we can correct it, because the UN talks of zero tolerance, but we know there's just too much tolerance for sexual abuse. So we held an extraordinary workshop at McGill for a week. We brought in 17 experts from all around the world, diplomatic, military, political, frontline workers, social activists. And we sat for a week and looked at every single aspect of this question of sexual exploitation and abuse in peacekeeping operations run by the UN or run by other organizations. We came out with a with a very serious report, and we said to ourselves, okay, we're going to start an initiative, and we're going to call it Code Blue. The blue helmet, Code Blue in hospitals, sort of matches the urgency. And we will initiate it sometime in the spring of 2015, and we will make it clear to the United Nations that we're not going to tolerate it any longer. And that's pretty presumptuous because we're a small group of 10 or 12 people, but we do have access, and we do have voice, and we do have a dogged tenacity. People began to learn that we were interested in the subject matter, and we started getting leaked documents. And in March and April of 2015, last year, some of you will have read of this, we received the report of interviews with 6, 8, and 9-year-old boys in the Central African Republic who had been forced to perform fellatio on French peacekeepers in return for morsels of bread and some milk. And then the little boys were sodomized by the French peacekeepers. And what stunned us was that the reports had ascended to the highest levels of the United Nations system, and they had been suppressed. No one said a word. The reviews, which were taken by officers of the United Nations High Commission on Human Rights and UNICEF, the reporting, which was done in May of June in 2014, had never been told to the world, while these little boys in an internally displaced refugee camp at the airport in Bangui in the Central African Republic were being raped by peacekeepers. So we took it to the Guardian newspaper in the United Kingdom on April 29th last year, and they published the story, and all hell broke loose in Europe and in the United States. Not much coverage in Canada, but everywhere it focused on what in God's name was going on. How was it possible that 9 months passed with the rape of little boys and no one was told? Who's in charge? Who's responsible? Why is it happening? And the French jurists and President Hollande himself said, this is a crime beyond belief. We are going to deal with this. To this day, not a single French soldier has been charged, not one, since April of last year. And the little boys in there, I mean, I've read the reports, they identified the soldiers. The soldiers had, they had tattoos, they wore rings, they had bangles in the ears, they had marks which identified them, but nothing has happened. After the report came out on April 29th, on May 15th, we launched Code Blue in New York at the Ford Foundation in New York, and it was anchored by Graça Machel at one end. Graça Machel, the magnificent African luminary who is the widow of Nelson Mandela, a remarkable woman, and at the other end by General Romeo Dallaire. So we had just these wonderful people, plus Paula herself and an ambassador from Bangladesh, which provides the largest number of peacekeepers, and the woman who is head of the Africa Women's Development Fund. We had an extraordinary press conference, a lot of publicity, more material came to us, and on May 29th, 1 month later, we released a series of internal emails and statements from the UN showing a cover-up at the highest levels of the United Nations. Now, honest to God, you have to ask yourself, what possesses these people? This was at the level of Under-Secretaries General. This went right to the cabinet of the Secretary General. This went right into the office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. It was staggering. It was clear that they were more interested in their own reputations and the reputation of the UN than in doing anything about saving the lives or personae of these children in the Central African Republic. At that point, the governments of the United Nations got mad. And the member states were aroused. And they went to the Secretary General and they said, we want an investigation, because my little group was clamoring for an investigation. And the Secretary General first tried to fob it off, and unexpectedly, 15 governments went to him and said, if you don't initiate a review of what you're doing in the peacekeeping operations around sexual abuse, we're passing a resolution and we're going to force your hand. So on June the 3rd, unprecedented, he not only fired the head of the representative of himself, the head of the operation in the Central African Republic, but he announced that he would appoint a panel of review. And on June 27, he appointed a panel of review, and it was headed by Judge Marie Deschamps, the former Canadian judge on the Supreme Court of Canada who did the investigation into the Canadian military. And it was a review panel of 3. And on December 17th last, I mean, we're talking about current events, December 17th last, she produced her report. I was saying to Nancy earlier, it was a merciless indictment of the United Nations. It was soul-destroying in what it found. It used the phrase gross institutional failure. It named people for abuse of authority. It named all the people at the top. It talked about the conspiratorial nature of what had happened and how impossible it was to believe that you could sacrifice children, girls, women, simply because you were more interested in your own sanctity. And everybody is now waiting to see how the Secretary General of the United Nations will respond, because he keeps on talking about a culture of zero tolerance. And since December 17th, every week or so, another report of child or women sexual abuse in the Central African Republic. And there are 16 such peacekeeping missions. It happens beyond that. So we were trying to figure out, what can you do in this instance? And we have, in the last few days, put out a major statement saying that effectively what the UN calls sexual exploitation and abuse should be put into a kind of receivership, a kind of guardianship, where you create a panel composed of the military, the academics, the bureaucrats, and you take it out of the UN system entirely and report directly to the member states for 2 or 3 years until you finally bring coherence, sanity, and justice to the way in which sexual abuse is treated. And then I get up this morning. I mean, it's just unbelievable. And suddenly there is an announcement that they've got another 4 cases of rape in the Central African Republic from peacekeepers. And then there is a noon briefing at the United Nations today in New York. And suddenly it's joined by an Assistant Secretary General who said, well, the rapes that we told you about this morning, they were rapes committed by European peacekeepers, but now we have to tell you that there are a number of rapes that have been committed by United Nations peacekeepers as well. And everybody's apologizing, and the Secretary General is talking about betrayal, and it's gone on for 15 years, and it never changes, and it's constantly fragmented and uncoordinated. And meanwhile, the victims never get justice. They never know who their rapists are. They don't know how to report. They don't know whether someone's charged, or whether someone's indicted, or whether someone has immunity. And I mention all of this to you because it's simply gender inequality. It all comes back to the reality that when you're dealing with these issues which involve the lives and rights of women, you can never get bloody traction. You have to fight like hell to overcome the obfuscation, the damage control, the extraordinary obstacles that are established to protect, well, largely to protect men. And I'm really weary of it. And this fascinating exercise in Code Blue has been a revelation to me. Let me tell you something which was nice for my soul rather than rancorous. Last Tuesday night, my co-director and I were in Amsterdam at a particular event which was awarding international development grants. And we were given a grant of 2.5 million euros to deal with the pursuit of Code Blue and to make sure that what is happening in the UN system is brought to an end. And it made me feel good, you know, that the world will sometimes come together and support initiatives which deal so directly with questions of gender equality. I'm sorry to drive that through the wall, but it is a fascinating manifestation of the way the organizations on which we rely can misbehave.